It was spring of 2006, and I had just finished an easy half-day shift at the place where I work. It was roughly 5 p.m. when I turned into my neighborhood in Georgia. As soon as I pulled up my driveway and parked my car, I heard a weird noise coming from my neighbor's backyard. It sounded like somebody growling or grunting repeatedly for no reason that I could explain. At first, it scared me badly. All these primal instincts told me that something was most definitely going wrong in this scenario. I'm glad most of them have faded away over time. That was weird to start with, because if you hear a low growl or snarl, surely you would think at first it was an animal. Something nosing through the trash, maybe. Although it was still light. But every single cell in my body told me this was not just a stray dog or raccoon. I also seemed to know instinctively it was not a human, not a burglar. My neighbors hadn't been raped and murdered yet, thank God. Yet, I also sensed very real and immediate danger. At that moment, I realized it was midweek. Both of the adults in the house would be working late, which meant the two high school-aged kids, if they were home, would be all alone. Every part of me wanted to drive away, or just sit in the car and wait for those noises to be over. But I had to see, had to check whatever it was in the yard was not going to hurt the kids. I wasn't much older myself back then, but enough to want to try at least to protect them. Their yard gate had been busted for years, so I was able to gently push it open without any real fuss. Our entire street backs on this amazing golf course. Although we were at the far end, there are still beautiful trees and scenery at the end of the yards. Standing over by those trees leading out onto the course was something I'll never be able to explain. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal. It stood maybe 4 feet tall, on 2 legs, but hunched over so its long arms almost dragged the floor. It was a pale color, not quite white but close, looking hairless. Its head was like that of a deer in a way, with huge antlers that seemed to defy gravity. It was super skinny, almost just bone, and had huge black orbs for eyes. It was growling like a dog would, that low rumble when they are protecting something. I may be a grown man now, but back then, I was just a tender 21-year-old. I'm not afraid to say I screamed. Nothing prepares you for something like that. The back door flew open, and my 16-year-old neighbor flew out, his sister still inside. He saw something hot-footed into the trees, but always claimed he thought it was a buck, due to those antlers. We never saw or heard anything like it again. I swear, it was not a deer. I was on a fishing trip out in central Alaska with my brother and our friend Mike. We had been putting in 70 miles per day of hard driving over several days. We were finally able to relax around the fire with some good beer, good laughs, and guitar music. I'm not sure what time it was when it happened, but about an hour or so into the beer, Mike suddenly put his hands to his lips, indicating we stop talking. We just thought he was messing about, but he almost hissed at us to shut up. Then, in that moment, we knew something was very off. It was really dark, but the fire gave off some light, and we had flashlights, but mainly the camp was surrounded in shadow. Having already sunk in a few beers, to be honest, at first, although I could clearly see Mike was worried, I thought it must have just been his imagination. He was just seeing shadows or some nosy critter that meant us no harm. We were getting ready to laugh about it, call him out. And then, we saw what was 100% fear on his face. Mike has never been good at acting. Whatever he thought he could see, it had scared the crap out of him. And this guy was a guy who had grown up hunting and claimed there was nothing that he could not kill. My brother and I were still facing him, facing away from whatever was spooking him, when we all heard the noise. It was nasty, like something being ripped, wet and squelchy. Then we all screamed as a fish head landed right in the middle of where we were sitting. It had clearly been ripped off the body, as part of the spine was still attached. What was that? Who would do this to try and scare us? The hell is that? I whispered. Mike was still, staring up behind us. I've seen him get into bar fights with a dude twice his size and never seen that look of fear on his face ever before. Not like this. My brother was itching to get the gun and just start shooting. I wanted to make sure he were armed and ready, but also know what we were up against before we did any shootouts. I still could not believe it. I could not believe it to be anything that would necessarily fall into the unexplained category. I just didn't believe in any of that kind of stuff. Until I turned around. Now, in that moment, I knew exactly why Mike was freaking out. Despite the darkness, the fire and our flashlights and lanterns gave off just enough of a glow to illuminate the silhouette of this creature. It was tall, and I mean huge. Me and Mike are roughly 6 feet. My brother about 6'3". But this thing towered over us, and it was wide too, built like a pro ball player or wrestler. Before anybody says it could have been a bear, we've been hunting and fishing for years. We know our animals. This wasn't like nothing we'd ever seen. I'm telling you, it wasn't right. It looked to be covered in hair, but it was hard to tell for sure. It had dark skin on the face too, by the looks of it. What was clear though, clear as if it were the middle of day, were its eyes. Because, you see, they were red, glowing bright red like coals of fire. It threw something at us again, when I saw the remaining body of fish from before. I grabbed my gun, and we all began shooting. I'm guessing we hit it as it ran off. It wasn't safe to leave camp in the dark, but you can bet we didn't get a wink of sleep next day. There was no sign of it. We'd expected to find blood and fur on the ground, but nothing. No stray bullets either. We didn't wait to find out what had happened though. We packed up and just got out of there, not wasting time. It was only on the drive back that Mike said what must have been the most unnerving thing of all. Something I hadn't even processed until that moment. Through the whole thing, it never made a sound. The only noise we'd heard was it ripping that fish apart. It hadn't growled, howled, or hell, didn't even scream or yelp when we shot at it. And it didn't leave a trace of evidence behind. Just what was that thing? I was almost 4 at the time of my encounter. As my family and I were going to dinner, we saw this tall creature with long legs, walking in the opposite direction. Its head was large compared to its body, and it had glowing yellow eyes that would match a cat's eyes, but were much larger than a cat's. The creature didn't seem to pay any attention to our car as we're heading right toward it. I remember my mom had a hand over her mouth in fright, closing her eyes, willing to go away, whilst my dad seemed to be in a state of shock as he just drove slowly past, mouth open in wonder. I was in back. My baby sister, who wasn't even 2, was in the car seat next to me, but fast asleep. I just stared out the window looking at it. It didn't even look our way as we drove past, just carried on walking, and I turned a little in my seat so I could see the back of it as we continued on. That was when I noticed it was dragging something behind it. That something had left a trail of blood and gore. My dad must have looked in the mirror as suddenly he put his foot on the gas and we sped off. Going so fast, the sudden acceleration woke my sister. I kept looking out the back window until it was out of sight, but it never turned. Must have been too focused on its meal, I guess. My mind wants to tell me it was a deer it was dragging. My dad will even swear he saw antlers. But in my nightmares, I remember. Amongst all the blood, I saw one thing clear as day being dragged along behind that thing. A sneaker. My cousin and I were driving down a country road. It was a little past midnight. We were on our way home from a party at my uncle's house. We'd been at the party earlier in the evening, but we decided to stay over for another hour or so before finally heading home. As we drove through the winding back roads, just chatting about the part, family and stuff, we hit something. Now, it was pitch black, save for the headlights, and a country road. So, we immediately thought it could have been a deer or something else, maybe like a critter that had run across the road out of nowhere. The odd thing was, we hadn't seen anything run out. My cousin, who I'd call an experienced driver, he would have slammed on the brakes, but there had been no warning. Just a bang as the fender hit something and a bump as we went over whatever it was. Being decent people, he immediately stopped the car, jumped out. Hell, if it had been a dog or something, he would have wrapped it in his coat, found an emergency animal doctor. But what we saw on the road, illuminated only by the taillights, was not a dog or a deer. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. I couldn't work out if it was a large creature like bird or a small bird-like creature, if that makes any sense. All I know is it sure had wings, large wings, and it was lying face down behind the car, and it was all contorted and bent. My cousin, being the good Samaritan as he is, ran back to the car, grabbed an old blanket he had just sitting in the back seat. I didn't want to be alone for even a second with this thing, looking all bent and smashed, with those huge, way too big to be bird wings. I ran back to the passenger seat, grabbed my phone, more for the Light app, but I wish I've had it on me before. I grabbed hold of it from where it had been flung under my seat when we bumped into the thing, and I heard my cousin call out, "What the?" And when I went back to the rear to the car to join him, bearing in mind we'd only been there a matter of maybe 60 to 90 seconds, it was gone. We hadn't heard the wings, so it couldn't have flown off, but I couldn't even imagine how it could have walked or even crawled. This thing was busted. Sure enough, there was blood and feathers all over the road, and a trail kind of leading back over to the bushes. My cousin spent 20 minutes with a flashlight looking in the trees at the side of the road, just as thank God he was happy to give up. We heard a noise. Without a word of exaggeration, it was the most bone-chilling thing I've ever heard. It was like a human scream, only louder, more shrill, and was coming from exactly where the thing had crawled away into the trees. That was enough, and we jumped back into the car and drove far away.